The invention of national origins. It was one thing for David Reed and John Trevor to convince Congress that a system of quotas based on national origins was a conceptually sound and non-discriminatory way to align immigration with the composition of the American people. But it was quite another matter to actually design that system, to define the national origins of the American people, and to calculate the proportion of each group to the total population. The Johnson-Reed Act mandated the formation of a committee under the Departments of Commerce, Labor, and State to allocate quotas by 1927. Dr. Joseph A. Hill, an eminent statistician with a 30-year tenure at the Bureau of Census, chaired the quota board, as the committee was known. Computing the national origins quotas was arguably the most difficult challenge of Hill's career. Congress would reject reports submitted by the quota board and postpone implementation of the quotas twice before finally approving a third report in 1929. Indeed, the project was marked by doubt from the beginning. The law required quotas to be allocated to countries, sovereign nation-states recognized by the United States, in the same proportion that the American people trace their origins to those geographical areas through immigration or the immigration of their forebears. Census and immigration records upon which the quota board relied, however, were woefully incomplete. The census of 1790, the nation's first, did not include information about national origin or ancestry. The census did not differentiate the foreign-born until 1850 and did not differentiate the parental nativity of the native-born until 1890. Immigration was unrecorded before 1820 and not classified according to national origin until 1899, when the Immigration Service began designating immigrants by race or people. Immigration was not recorded at all until 1907 and not recorded according to nationality until 1909. To complicate things further, many boundaries in Europe changed after World War I, requiring a translation of political geography to reattribute origins and allocate quotas according to the world in 1920. Before the quota board could address the data, or lack of it, it had to conceptualize the categories that comprise the national origins quota system. National origin, native stock, nationality, and other categories were not natural units of classification. They were constructed according to certain social values and political judgments. For example, native stock did not refer to persons born in the United States, but to persons who descended from the white population of the United States at the time of the nation's founding. The board defined the immigrant stock population as all persons who entered the United States after 1790 and their progeny. The law defined nationality, the central concept of the quota system. According to country of birth, although the statute made no explicit reference to race, race entered the calculus and subverted the concept of nationality in a myriad of ways. Ironically, nationality did not mean country of birth as far as defining the American nationality was concerned. The law excluded non-white people residing in the United States in 1920 from the population universe governing the quotas. The law stipulated that the inhabitants in the continental United States in 1920 does not include immigrants from the Western Hemisphere or their descendants, aliens ineligible for citizenship or their descendants, the descendants of slave immigrants, or the descendants of the American Aborigines. The quota board applied the provision according to race categories in the 1920 census: white, black, mulatto, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Hindu. It discounted from the population all blacks and mulattoes, allotting the difference between the descendants of slave immigrants and the descendants of free Negroes and voluntary immigrants from Africa. It discounted all Chinese, Japanese, and South Asians as persons ineligible to citizenship, including those with American citizenship. Lost my place. Including those with American citizenship by native birth. The provision also included the territories of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Alaska, which American immigration law governed and whose natives were United States citizens. In other words, to the extent that the inhabitants of the continental United States in 1920 constituted a legal representation of the American nation, the law excised all non-white, non-European peoples from that vision, erasing them from the American nationality. On a practical level, eliminating non-white peoples from the formula resulted in larger quotas for European countries and smaller ones for other countries. For example, African Americans comprised 9% of the United States population in 1920. If they had been counted and their national origins in Africa considered, 9% of the quota would have been allocated to African nations, resulting in 13,500 fewer slots for Europe. Race altered the meaning of nationality in other ways as well. Formerly, the quota system encompassed all countries in the world except for those of the Western Hemisphere. China, Japan, India, and Siam each received the minimum quota of 100, but the law excluded the native citizens of those countries from immigration because they were deemed to be racially ineligible to citizenship. Congress thus created the oddity of immigration quotas for non-Chinese persons of China, non-Japanese persons of Japan, non-Indian persons of India, and so on. With regard to the independent African nations, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa received quotas of 100 each, amounting to a concession of 200 immigration slots for black Africans. European mandates and protectorates in Africa, the Near East, and the Far East, for example, Tanganyika, Cameroon, Palestine, New Guinea, each had their own quotas, which in practice served to increase the quotas of Great Britain, France, and Belgium, the nations with the largest colonial empires. Thus, while the national origin quota system indeed intended principally to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and used the notion of national origins to justify discrimination against immigrants from those nations, it did more than divide Europe. It also divided Europe from the non-European world. It defined the world formally in terms of country and nationality, but also in terms of race. The quota system distinguished persons of the colored races from white persons from white countries. The new taxonomy was starkly represented in a table of the population from the United States published in 1924, in which the column Country of Birth listed 53 countries, Australia to Yugoslavia, and 5 colored races, black, mulatto, Chinese, Japanese, Indians. In this presentation, white Americans and immigrants from Europe have national origins, that is, they may be identified by the country of their birth or their ancestors' birth, but the colored races were imagined as having no country of origin. They lay outside the concept of nationality and therefore citizenship. They were not even bona fide immigrants. Thus, the national origins quota system proceeded from the conviction that the American nation was and should remain a white nation descended from Europe. If Congress did not go so far as to sponsor race breeding, it did seek to transform immigration law into an instrument of mass racial engineering. The stream that feeds the reservoir should have all the same composition as the contents of the reservoir itself, Hill said. Acceptance of that idea doesn't necessarily imply a belief that the composition of the American people cannot be improved, but it does probably imply a conviction that it is not likely to be improved by unregulated immigration, but rather the contrary. Like most of their contemporaries, members of the Congress and the quota board treated race as self-evident, of differences that were presumed to be natural. Few, if any, doubted the Census Bureau's categories of race as anything other than objective divisions of an objective reality, even though the census's racial categories were far from static. Such confidence evinced the strength of race thinking generally, as well as the progressive faith in science, in this case, the sciences of demography and statistics. Indeed, few people doubted the census at all. Census data carried the weight of the official statistics. Its power lay in its formalization of racial categories. The census gave the quotas an imprimatur that was nearly unimpeachable and was invoked with remarkable authority as when during the floor debate in the House in 1924, Congressman William Whale retorted to an opponent of the national origins principle, "The gentleman does not agree with the census." I'm going to show you the picture in the book of the census. Demography and the census itself, far from being the simple quantification of a material reality, grew in the late 19th and early 20th century as a language of interpreting the social world. Census officials like Francis Amasa Walker and Richard Mayo Smith took the census beyond its constitutional function as an instrument of apportionment. As historian Margot Anderson observed, the classifications created for defining urban and rural populations, social and economic classes, and racial groups created a vocabulary for public discourse on the great social changes taking place in America at the time. Industrialization, urban growth, and of course, immigration. In fact, the census was the favored form of scientific evidence cited by restrictionists and nativists during this period. That practice actually began with census officials. Francis Walker, the superintendent of the 1870 and 1880 censuses, was president of MIT and a brilliant scholar in the new field of statistics. He was also an ardent nativist and social Darwinist who believed immigrants from Italy, Hungary, Austria, and Russia were vast masses of peasantry degraded below our utmost conceptions. Beaten men from beaten races representing the worst failures in the struggle for existence. Walker was a leading member of the Immigration Restriction League during the 1890s. Analyzing census data, Walker developed the theory that immigration retarded the natural birth rate of Americans, which he lauded as the highest in the world and as evidence of the nation's greatness. Because immigrants crowded native-born Americans from unskilled jobs, Walker theorized, the latter adjusted to their limited job opportunities by having fewer children. He considered immigration a shock to the principle of natural population increase. The causal link in this theory rested on the assumption that the nation possessed a natural character and teleology, to which immigration was external and unnatural. Those assumptions resonated with conventional views about America's providential mission, manifest destiny, and the general march of progress, yet they were rooted in the profoundly conservative viewpoint that the composition of the American nation should never change. Few people during the 1920s understood, much less accepted, Horace Callan's view that the English had settled the North American Atlantic seaboard not as a divine mission but as an accident of history. Walker's assumptions regarding natural population increase also involved a bit of sophistry. In 1873, Walker criticized that theory as Elkanah Watson had postulated it in the early 19th century, noting that the population of the United States had increased by about one-third during each of the 2 decades following the 1790 census. Watson made projections for the population increases up to 1900 based on the same extraordinary rate of growth. Francis Walker disagreed, stating, "Geometric progression is rarely attained in human affairs." Yet in the 1890s, Walker resuscitated Watson's theory to support the restrictionist agenda. As Walker developed the theory that immigration negatively affected population growth, he credited Watson's projections as evidence of America's high natural rate of growth and simply ignored the criticisms he had made 20 years before. Francis Walker's theory of the declining native birth rate and the census data upon which it was based became the foundation for the restrictionist claim that immigration threatened to overwhelm the American nation. It anchored Madison Grant's famous thesis that the great Nordic race was in danger of extinction. Paraphrasing Walker, Grant warned that upward mobility on the part of the native workers was a form of race suicide. A race that refuses to do manual work and seeks white-collar jobs, he said, is doomed through its falling birth rate to replacement by the lower races or classes. In other words, the introduction of immigrants as lowly laborers means a replacement of race. Similarly, a 1922 publication by the Commonwealth Club of California on immigration and population carried the subtitle, "The Census Returns Prove that Immigration in the Past Century Did Not Increase the Population, but merely replaced one race stock by another." Like Francis Walker, Joseph Hill also came from an elite old line New England family. The son of a minister and a cousin of Henry Adams, he graduated from Exeter and Harvard, as did his father and grandfather, and received his Ph.D. at Halle, Germany. Although Hill began his tenure at the Census Bureau in 1899, 2 years after Walker's death, he held many of the same views. In 1910, Hill contributed 2 monographs to the Dillingham Commission's study of immigration, using previously unpublished and untabulated census data, which were of great importance to the restrictionist movement. The first study analyzed occupational distribution by nativity. The second determined the differentials in fecundity between the foreign-born, the native-born of foreign-born parents, and native-born of native parents. Not coincidentally, these studies provided additional empirical evidence to Francis Walker's theory of the retarded native birth rate. Like other scientists and social scientists that believed in racial difference, Hill strove for ever more practiced categories of classification and comparisons of type. He added new questions to the census in 1910 and 1920 that were aimed at elucidating differences in race and nationality in increasing detail. Hill restored the mulatto race category, which had been eliminated in the 1900 census, and added questions to ascertain literacy, ability to speak English, mother tongue, number of children born and living, length of time in the United States. He was particularly interested in creating indices to gauge assimilation and presenting data in tables that made racial comparisons convenient.